Ecological systems are complex and interconnected such that the removal or addition of a single species within an ecosystem can have an effect on several other species and sometimes on a region as a whole. Ecology is the natural science of living systems and the biodiversity they contain. Bio 230 has explained the concepts of ecology from an organismal level to a biospheric level, and in this video, I'll speak about a certain ecological example which showcases the critical balance needed to maintain an ecosystem. Wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone Park in 1995, and this single change brought about an enormous ecological change for Yellowstone National Park on a regional scale. Due to this, I ask, what consequences were experienced by existing species at Yellowstone National Park after the reintroduction of wolves to this environment? Wolves are a secondary consumer, and they were a prevalent species throughout North America prior to European colonization of this continent. Wolves possess species requirements which include resources such as a large number of ungulates to feed on, whilst being able to survive in a wide variety of conditions, which included several biomes present between central Mexico and the polar tundra. As humans progressively migrated throughout North America, they forced the wolves to relocate to habitats consisting of primarily forested and mountainous areas. Nevertheless, wolves were able to thrive in habitats such as Yellowstone Park, which contained an abundance of ungulate resources and favorable conditions which were away from human civilization. Despite this, humans eventually discovered the safe haven of wolves throughout the late 1800s. As people began moving westwards towards Yellowstone Park, hunting of many animals, including wolves, substantially increased. Wolves were especially hunted during this time, as they were feared by many people and because they often preyed upon cattle belonging to ranchers in this geographical area. By the 1920s, the wolf population in the region had declined below the minimum viable population size, which means the wolves in the region were expected to go to extinction due to the Ali effect. And by 1926, wolves had gone extinct in Yellowstone Park, primarily due to the effects of human hunting and the Ali effect. Soon after the elimination of wolves from the Yellowstone Park ecosystem, drastic changes began to occur within this habitat. By the 1930s, scientists had observed that the elk population had exploded in Yellowstone as their primary predator, the wolf, had been removed from this ecosystem. Elk have a large fundamental and realized niche, as they're able to survive in many conditions, which include forests, swamps, mountains, prairies, and even the tundra. Moreover, elk are both grazers and browsers, meaning they can eat grasses, shrubs, and trees. In the absence of wolves, elk populations were able to graze in open grasslands and valleys near the riverbank with reduced fear of being spotted by a possible predator. Because of this, the elk population began to overgraze, and this resulted in substantial degradation of the park. In particular, species such as willow, aspen, and cottonwood experienced significant population declines. This sudden increase in elk population didn't just affect plant populations, but this also influenced many species within the Yellowstone ecosystem. The community's species evenness was affected as elk populations began to significantly outnumber the populations of their competing species. Some species, such as grizzly bears, were outcompeted by elk for resources such as berries, and this led to some bears dying due to starvation in the winter, as berries are a critical resource for grizzly bears in the region. Animals such as hummingbirds and insects also lost a source of food, as many flowers and open valleys were destroyed by grazing elk. Mammals like rabbits and mice suffered population declines in the area due to habitat loss via the elk. Elk consumed the grasses and shrubs in which these animals lived, and this left many of these small mammals susceptible to predation by coyotes and eagles. Finally, beavers experienced some of the harshest population declines as they were unable to build their homes due to a lack of trees within the community by the riverbanks. These riverbanks severely deteriorated due to the increased elk population. As the elk grazed by the riverbank, they were constantly drinking water from the river, and their hooves eroded many riverbanks, which further contributed to the decline of several species populations, including beavers. All in all, the removal of wolves from Yellowstone Park led to elk populations skyrocketing past their usual carrying capacity in this environment, and a substantial increase in elk within the area negatively impacted community composition as several other species experienced population declines. Scientists slowly realized the negative impact large elk populations were having on the regional scale within Yellowstone Park. The federal government even attempted to control this immense growth of elk populations amidst the 1960s. Yellowstone Park's carrying capacity for elk in the absence of wolves was approximately 18,000, and the federal government invested millions of dollars in removing and redistributing elk to other locations within the United States. The government was able to reduce the elk population in Yellowstone to about 5,000, which was then deemed to be a stable amount which would cause less harm to the ecosystem of Yellowstone Park. The late 1960s saw a string of natural disasters such as droughts and forest fires hit the region, and because of these disturbances, the elk population fell to almost as low as 3,500, which was slightly above the minimum viable population size for elk within the area, and due to this, the government stopped removing elk from Yellowstone following 1968. In the following years, the elk population began to quickly rise again, and this time, scientists and the government began looking for a more permanent solution which would be able to control elk populations. The Endangered Species Act was created in 1974, and the wolf was one of the animals which was added to this list, and soon after this event, scientists and biologists collectively began planning the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone Park in order to control the population of elk. Although they face a strong opposition in the form of local ranchers and hunters, wolves were planned to be reintroduced back into Yellowstone Park in 1995, 69 years after their extinction from this regional area. In 1995, 14 wolves were transported from Jasper National Park in Canada to Yellowstone National Park in the United States. Wolves are animals which have a large roaming area and homing instinct. Because of this, acclimation pens were built in which these new wolves were able to spend 14 weeks and get used to their new habitat. This was done because it was feared that these newly imported wolves would actively disperse back towards their homes in the north. Following the release of these wolves back into the wild, some wolves remained within Yellowstone, whilst others migrated north of the border. Furthermore, a total of 41 wolves were reintroduced to this region throughout all of 1995, but as seen in this graph, only 21 decided to stay within the borders of Yellowstone. In the following years, wolf populations gradually increased, and elk populations, which many individuals had hoped to control, did in fact decrease. The reintroduction of wolves didn't just impact elk populations, but in fact the entire ecosystem was impacted by the wolves being brought back into this community. It was observed that elk within the area changed their behavior in response to one of their primary predators being present once again. Instead of mainly remaining in the open valleys and grasslands by the riverbanks, elk began to move much more, and the population began to browse and graze less often. As elk resided more frequently within heavy forested areas in order to avoid predation by wolves, this gave many other species within the valleys and riverbanks a chance to flourish and rebound. For instance, cottonwood and willow tree populations grew significantly, and aspen trees were able to grow up to 5 times their height prior to the reintroduction of wolves in just 6 years. The increase of tree abundance provided several small mammals a critical resource which they were able to utilize in order to avoid frequent predation, thus allowing their populations to also grow. The riverbanks were also able to recover after years of erosion done in the presence of large numbers of elk. The revival of the riverbanks, coupled with the increased availability of resources such as trees, led to the subsequent increase in beaver populations being observed within Yellowstone. The return of beaver dams in the area also brought forth increased habitats for fish and amphibians. Moreover, competing species such as bison and bears, which competed for resources such as grasses and berries with elk, were now able to increase their populations as the competition coefficient of elk decreased on these animals as their own numbers dwindled. Numerous species rebounded after the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone Park, and several biomes within the park have once again started to prosper in recent times. This event is a perfect example of a trophic cascade where indirect interactions caused by the reintroduction of wolves led to changes within the entire ecosystem. In recent years, this regional area has become much more stable, with a higher Shannon's index being observed due to greater species evenness within communities in Yellowstone. In the last decade, the population of wolves has fluctuated around a carrying capacity of 100, whilst the population of elk has fluctuated around a population of 5,000. Additionally, the trophic levels here have been able to return to stable levels as their primary producers, primary consumers, and secondary consumers have all been present in much more equal abundances ever since wolves were brought back into this environment. The riverbanks, open valleys, and grasslands have all recovered tremendously, and this in return has fueled the population increases experienced by several species which are largely dependent on these biomes. Overall, this species reintroduction has often been used as a prime example as to why secondary consumers are critical to their ecosystems, as they're able to keep primary consumers in check, which in return prevents the overconsumption of primary producers, which themselves are the foundations of ecosystems. In conclusion, Yellowstone National Park has experienced tremendous positive ecological growth ever since wolves were brought back into this ecosystem in 1995, and this change has caused society to realize the importance every native species has within its own ecosystem. If you made it to the end of the video, I'd like to thank you for tuning in to my ecology project. A list of citations has been provided here, which includes all video footage utilized in this YouTube video, alongside the research conducted to produce this video. Thank you.